Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and... so this is the 11th lecture of Behavioral Neuroscience A. Today's talk is about multisensory integration. There's going to be 2 more lectures. The next one is about attention, and I'll upload it in probably an hour. And the next one after that is about motor planning. I'm not sure if I'm going to add an extra one on the end there, but there won't be a quiz about it even if I do. But depending on whether I want to round out the material and put a lecture about more complex motor neuroscience, it will depend on that. So today the talk is about multisensory integration. So until now, we have talked mostly about what's sometimes called unisensory or unimodal perceptual systems, things like vision or audition or somatosensation, touch or pain, right? Right? Now we're going to talk about how the body integrates multiple of these and at the same time. Because of course you never just, oftentimes stimuli are shared across multiple perceptual modalities. You see the carpet and you touch the carpet and you feel that it's bound together. So I mean, for example, like a car, is red. You can see the car, and you can also hear the car moving, right? Or a cat, like you see it making a sound, like with its mouth, like hissing, and you hear the hiss, right? Today I'm going to talk about something kind of like this: the audiovisual integration of speech. How humans integrate speech, because it's an easy example to understand. Then I'll talk a little bit about the brain areas, the neurophysiology of multisensory integration, and the different, the different phenomena that arise in multisensory integration. Then I'll talk about audio-visual integration, how vision dominates audition in humans, using a little video example. And at the very end, I'll talk about synesthesia, a sort of, I don't know if I should call it a disorder, but a condition that in which people can sense other perceptions from other modalities than the one that is physically presented. So first, I'm going to talk about integration of audiovisual speech signals. So this is, a very famous example. I'm going to show you a quick video. It's called the McGurk effect, after the McGurk and McDonald. They published a paper explaining it. Basically, I'm going to... Basically, let me explain a little bit before I do it. Basically, there's a video, and the person in the video will say the sound ba, right? Well, actually, it's an artificially created video. Basically, the sound of that person saying ba a different time is combined with the video of him saying ga with the sound removed, right? And because of the mismatch between you seeing the person trying to say ga and you hear the ba, your brain puts it together and you end up hearing something in between the two, which is da, right? And I'll explain a little bit why that happens in a moment, but let's watch the video first. I don't know if you can hear it very well. It's on the Panda, so you can watch it yourself.
Ba 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 ba, ba ba, ba ba.
So maybe since I already told you what was going to happen, you might have, it might not seem such a strong effect for you. But if I showed you the video before you knew it, and I asked you what sound you heard, you'd probably answer something like da. And this is, I mean, this is like a well demonstrated, sort of scientific observation. It's not, just something that some guy did on, for like a popular video or something like this. You can have some explanation for why this happens, right? So da is kind of in between ba and ga, because ba, you use the lip front here. Ga, you use the velum, which is the soft palate up on the top here, whereas da is actually in between. So basically, the person is the sound is this sound, the video is this sound, and so basically your brain kind of averages them together, and you hear the sound. You hear the sound that would be produced by this region. It's kind of an interesting. It might be a coincidence it works out that way, but this is maybe the explanation for why it could occur. And this is just a time frequency diagram of ba and ga. So I mean, when you have ba and ga, so I mean, you get these different. This is actually the vowels over here, but during the ba and the ga part of it, you have these slightly different things. So maybe if you average these two sort of time frequencies together, you'd have one that looked basically like da. I know a lot of you are native Japanese speakers, and so actually you might not have this effect as clearly as someone who is like a native English speaker, because actually there's a lot of evidence showing that in Japanese, for example, a language where people don't move their mouths very much, or a lot of very different sounds have similar looking mouth movements. People of the native speakers of those languages don't care so much about the visual stimulus as much as ones in other languages, like in English, where there's a lot of different mouth movements for different sounds. So here is showing American English native speakers or Japanese native speakers, and basically this is showing the number correct, the number that they got correct saying what sound was said, and basically, so this white dot ones is AV minus. This means it's just the sound, no video, right? And of course, they put some noise. So as you increase the amount of noise, increase the clarity of the signal. So as you decrease the amount of noise. So this is very noisy. This is very noisy situation. This is very clear situation. You see that the accuracy when it's very noisy is very low if they don't have the video. Whereas as you decrease the amount of noise, it increases. For Japanese speakers, they increase faster than the native English speakers as you reduce noise, or even like when there is noise, they already have a sort of higher accuracy, and that's true for both native stimuli. So in other words, sounds in the language, or non-native stimuli, so just some other sounds. Where does your so now I'm going to move over to the neurophysiology of multisensory integration. Where does your brain integrate these, and how does your brain integrate these different modalities, the sound and the sight? Previously, we talked about sort of unisensory areas, right? We talked about auditory cortex. We talked about visual cortex. We talked about somatosensory cortex and things like this. But there are actually parts of the brain, in fact, most parts of the brain, actually receive input from multiple different sensory modalities. So, for example, this is actually a brain area I study a lot. The superior colliculus is phylogenetically, it's an old, like a sort of a reptilian part of the brain. It's a midbrain structure sitting on top of the brainstem. It's above the inferior colliculus, which we talked about in the auditory lecture. There's sort of two hills. There's like a hill, inferior colliculus, superior colliculus. And basically, the deeper layers of the superior colliculus, they have some neurons that respond to audiovisual and visual somatosensory stimuli. So they call these multimodal neurons. Superior colliculus is important because it's a very old structure that basically connects sort of the sight and sound to motor orienting movements. Basically, if you have a sudden sound that occurs, you'll turn towards it. It's called an orienting behavior. That response is driven by the superior colliculus. In a lot of humans, maybe in a lot of very sort of lower species as well, like fish and things like that, cats. And actually, a lot of research is done in cats. So here's some recording from a famous study from Meredith and Stein, where they were looking at these deep layer colliculus, superior colliculus neurons. And these neurons were shown either or exposed to either, the cat was exposed to either only a sound or only a sight, like a light dot, or it was exposed to both. And so this is the spike histograms of the cell, and you can see that basically the cell responds a very small amount to just the sound. This is the auditory sound. It's turned on and then off for about 200 milliseconds. Just the sight, like the light is moves or turns on, right? And it responds a little bit more as maybe the sight. This is the raster, the spikes on each trial. It's trial 1, trial 2, trial 3, trial 4, trial 5, trial 6. At this time there was a spike. At this time there was a spike in trial. Yeah, you get the idea. This is the histogram summing all the numbers per time bin. And then when you put them both together, the sight and the sound, at roughly the same time, you get all these spikes in all the trials. Very robust effect. And the histogram looks something like this, where you get a massive bump of activity when you have the sight and the sound together. So this is called super additive, because if you add this plus this, then it's much smaller than this, right? So basically, this is more than linearly adding together just the sound and the sight response. This is called super additivity. And here's a bar graph just showing the number of spikes, number of impulses per trial is 326% bigger than the visual trial. So this is an example. Excuse me. This is an example of a neuron that has increased response enhancement, it's called. There's other cells, of course, that have the opposite. They change their response downward when there is both stimuli involved. So here's a case where you have visual stimuli. This neuron responds very strongly to visual stimuli, right? When you introduce the stimulus, it's boom, 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 it's a very strong response. So visual only response looks like this. But when you add at the same time an auditory stimulus, that auditory stimulus like removes the visual response of the cell. So this cell is kind of like saying, oh, there's vision but no sound. There's a dot, but there's a sight but no sound. And this is just two different ways of showing the data. One is just the number of impulses during the trial. The other one is number of impulses in the trial after this line, basically. After 175 to 500 after stimulus onset. So basically they just take the number of impulses between this time. Maybe they arbitrarily chose the time because that's when the auditory stimulus is suppressing the visual response. I don't know why. They're trying to quantify the amount that it's reducing, I think. One thing that's important for this effect, both the reduction and enhancement, is that for integration of different modalities to happen well, you have to have them basically happening at the same time. It's called temporal alignment, right? So basically, here's an experiment where they basically move the timing of the sound from being before the vision to being sort of a little bit further, a little bit after the vision, right? So here's this case where it's sort of happening near the end of the vision event. And it's pretty broad temporal window, right? You can move. This is moving it over almost like 1 second of timing of difference the whole time. You can see that the neural response stays existing. It does decrease as you move further away from happening at exactly the same time, but it stays having some response. This is indicating that the audition is 200 milliseconds before the start of the vision. Audio and vision at exactly the same time they start, and vision happens. Then 200 milliseconds later, the auditory happens. So this might happen because maybe the brain knows that light and sound travel at different speeds, and so if something's really far away, it doesn't want to make a mistake when something's far away, and so it sort of allows to have kind of a fuzzy timing. And you can plot this as a single bar graph, number of spikes, or percent enhancement based on the sliding time offset. And you see that the best timing for response enhancement is about negative. So the sound happening 50 milliseconds before the video, or starting at the same time as the video, basically. Excuse me. The second important factor of multisensory integration, especially in the colliculus, is what's called spatial congruence. Basically, in order to get the most response of the multisensory cell, you have to have the stimuli sourced, coming from the same direction, right? So if you see someone talking, but the sound of their talking is coming from behind you, that feels very weird for you, right? It's the same idea with the neural response, of course. So here's an example showing the response of a cell to a visual stimulus, where so this is the hemifield. So this is like, imagine this being like this is right exactly in front of you. This is way over to your left side. This is way over to your right side, right? This is up above you. This is down below you. So basically, this one cell they're recording from, if you put a light or a stimulus or some vision thing inside this area, a little bit to the left of center, this cell will have strong responses. If you play any sound that comes from a speaker that's anywhere sort of to the left side of the middle, it will also have a response, this cell. So this is called the receptive field of this cell, the visual receptive field of the cell, and the auditory receptive field of the cell. And basically, you have to have so if you play a sound over here, it's not sort of happening in the visual area, and so the response is going to be much weaker. If you play it here where they're overlapping, then you'll get this nice, really strong response enhancement. Whereas if you play it outside the receptive field, it's going to have almost no response. But if you play it just in a single location, like maybe here, I don't know, you're going to have a unimodal. If you only play a sound, you're going to have a response like this. One final property of multisensory integration is what's called inverse effectiveness. And we saw this when we were looking at the Japanese and English speakers. If you increase the noise, the accuracy would fall off. The same idea happens. Basically, the multisensory effect of a neuron is going to be stronger when the stimuli are noisy or hard to see, right? So basically, this situation, you'll get a relatively higher increase from the unisensory responses than you would in this situation, where it won't increase much higher from the unisensory responses, right? So this is maybe like plus 15% increase of the, whereas this one is like plus 200% or something increase in the response of the cell. And so that's called inverse effectiveness. Basically, as you increase the fidelity of each stimulus, visual, auditory, etc., the effectivity of multisensory integration decreases. It makes sense because you have all the information in each of the different modalities. Your brain doesn't really need to boost the response. The information is already all there, high probability. Here's an example from a study looking at STS, which is a superior temporal sulcus. Sulcus between the temporal lobe, on the top of the temporal lobe. And basically, they looked at the difference of the multisensory versus the unimodal stimuli as you made the stimuli more or less weak and changed the accuracy. And so you can see in the case where so A plus V here means that they're just adding together the audio response and the visual response. AV means this is the response of the brain when they're played at the same time. So this is when they're played separately and when they're played at the same time. And so you can see in this case, when they're played separately, the brain has no response. But when they're played together, it has this sort of big response, right? Whereas in the case where the people are really accurate, probably because the stimuli are not noisy, there's the individual played separately ones, if you add them together, actually has more activity, more bold signal than the case where they're played together. So to summarize the different principles of multisensory integration, there's temporal congruence. You get stronger responses when there are temporally congruent audiovisual stimuli, when they basically happen at the same time. There's also spatial congruence. The responses are strongest when the stimuli come from a similar direction. And Finally, inverse effectiveness. The multisensory responses are stronger for audiovisual stimuli that consist of weak unisensory stimuli. So in other words, you get more strong multisensory responses when you have sort of more noisy responses, sort of more noisy visual and auditory stimuli. So now I've been talking about the direction and the timing of stimuli affecting the multisensory integration. But you might also think, what about the contents? What about the meat of the signal being transmitted? A lot of times with cats, they just use, for example, like a sound, like a tone, like beep, and a light or something like that. But of course, in humans, in real life, you have, stimuli have meaning. If someone's talking to you, or you're looking at like a video, the sounds and the sights should match up, or else it's surprising, right? So they did a study with looking at different brain areas that respond when you have semantically congruent or incongruent stimuli. So basically, you can have auditory stimuli, which is like ba, or the sound of a phone ringing, ring, ring. And then you have pictures, like a picture of a sheep or a picture of a phone. And you can, of course, have what are called congruent stimuli, where you have ba and sheep or ring and phone. Or you can mix them up, right? You can have ba with this phone and ring, ring with a sheep, right? It's kind of weird. And so they looked at the multimodal response when in a couple of different areas, and found that oops, I don't have the next figure from it. That's okay. Basically found, so basically the occipital lobe, like visual areas, they respond to visual stimuli. It makes sense. Auditory cortex on both sides, some language areas also respond to auditory stimuli. That makes sense. But some locations actually were responding to both they respond to best to the combination of the two stimuli happening together with the same meaning. So they basically looked at these three very areas: the dorsolateral prefrontal, ventral temporal cortex, and posterior temporal sulcus, or the middle temporal gyrus, which is something we'll talk about more. They respond more for multimodal than unimodal stimuli when they have semantic congruence of the contents. Okay. So oftentimes people have thought of brain areas like, especially like this temporal sulcus, superior temporal sulcus, or middle temporal gyrus, are what people think of as multisensory areas. They're integration areas. So this is kind of a traditional view of multisensory processing, where basically you get sound and you get sight, and then basically those are processed separately and then combined in some special areas of the brain called integration areas or multisensory association areas. That's a traditional view. And there is evidence that shows that this happens. So for example, there's neurons in macaque VIP, ventral interparietal area, that have overlapping visual. The neurons inside there have overlapping receptive fields for auditory and visual inputs. And in VIP, there's also some somatosensory and vestibular input, which might be guiding head and mouth movements or something like that, to understanding head and mouth movements. So here's an example of they map out the receptive field of some neurons, and then they plot them on a plot. Says left or right, left, up, down, straight forward is in the middle, and so this neuron responds sort of down and left for sound, and a little bit different shape, similar direction for sight. And so that's, they say, oh, that must be a sort of association area. A lot of these association areas, though, might be related to defensive behaviors, and they tend to be really sensitive to approaching stimuli or nearby stimuli. So they have stronger responses based on the perceived distance of a stimulus. And if you electrically stimulate those areas, it often causes defensive behavior, like turning away, closing the eyes, or holding out your hand to block something coming at you. These are all studied in macaque and monkeys. Of course, humans, sort of similar to monkeys, we also have what are called integration areas that people have found. Most famous is maybe the STS, superior temporal sulcus, which is responses to auditory and visual stimuli, things like the McGurk effect. It's important for like synchronizing movement of mouths and sound of speech. Whereas other brain areas might respond more to objects and sounds together, like pictures and sounds. STS is about basically combining sight and sound. But actually, of course, there's so I mentioned that was the traditional view of having sort of these special multimodal integration areas for integrating sensory modalities. But actually, that there's a lot of evidence recently that there are also direct connections from the different unisensory cortices to the other ones. So in other words, when you hear a sound, your primary visual cortex, V1, right? Normally we think of that as just getting visual input. Actually, V1 cells do have a response. They get input from auditory information and do have responses to the auditory information. And so the traditional model that you have special integration areas might not be the only story, right? It also might be some part of it that's related to direct connections between what are thought of as unisensory cortices. So here's an example. There's a paper from Falchier et al. From cerebral cortex where they found direct connections from V1 to auditory cortex and from auditory cortex to V1. And similarly, so not just in V1, but also in higher level visual areas, like, for example, the lateral occipital lobe in humans, they found kind of like maybe, I don't know, V5 in monkeys or something. The lateral occipital lobe responded not only to visual objects, like which we knew, but also when someone touched something, tactile objects, the neurons also sometimes responded to those. So they had this experimental setup where they would have a somatosensory object, have a texture, and then have visual textures, and then another visual object, and you could see. So this is a picture of a carpet, and then also the people would feel the carpet, also. And you'd have responses in the visual area when the person saw when the person touched the carpet, right? Not seeing the carpet. This is kind of related to the idea of the spatial congruence, but in humans especially, vision is a very strong sensory modality, and so people are affected by what's called visual capture. Oftentimes you'll sort of how should I say? You'll rely more on visual information. You'll give it higher accuracy than sound information, which might be different than something like a cat or a dog, where the sound is what they think is more accurate. So with the human, when this causes the ventriloquism effect, right? Where if someone talks, doesn't move his mouth very much, but moves the mouth of his puppet a lot, it sounds like the sound is coming from the puppet's mouth, even though it's actually this guy who's talking. And that's probably for humans is because the visual cues have higher reliability, so we tend to prefer them. So I'm going to show another video really quickly, but basically you can prove kind of that in humans the visual information is more stronger than the auditory information by, for example, having this video where you have to count the number of beeps. This is, you can watch this video at on your own computer. And so basically the task here is I'm going to flash some black circles, and I want you to count how many times does the disc flash. So, I mean, it's really short and simple, but I think you get the idea. Basically, the second time it flashed, it went beep, and then beep beep, right? And the beep, even though it was exactly the same disc, maybe because of the sound, it affected it. It made it look kind of like the disc disappeared and then reappeared, right? Actually, it was exactly the same as the first time. It was just disc, but the sound was beep beep, so it looked like the second time the disc sort of like blinked. At least it looks like it to me. So because of that, the sound can affect the perceived timing of a visual flash. So in this case, it's a little bit different because actually for sound, the timing is maybe more accurate for humans than for sight, which is why, for things like music, we do like beats, like boom, 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 boom. People tap their feet, and people are really good at keeping time with a beat, with sound information, and maybe they're less accurate at estimating time accuracy with a visual stimulus. So this final thing for today, I'm going to talk about a condition called synesthesia, where stimulation in one sensory modality can cause unusual experiences in a second modality that's usually unstimulated. So, for example, people can experience letters or words as a color. They can experience music as a color. They can experience numbers as objects, like the number 5 is a chair or something like that. Not the picture of the number 5, but the abstract idea of it. So maybe this guy, Marc Chagall, is a sort of relatively famous painter, early 20th century. Maybe it's proposed he had maybe some sort of personality color synesthesia. One objective test you can use to test synesthesia, whether the perceptions are, the perceptions are first order, like they actually happen immediately, is you can have a synesthetic person do a task like this, where you say search for the twos. There's a bunch of fives, number 5, number 5, number 5. You say search for the twos, and for me it takes a little while. I have to look around and find, oh, there's a 2. I look around, oh, there's a 2. Right? But for someone who's synesthetic, who experiences letters as numbers as colors, it might basically look like this. Like the perceptions might be immediately accessible as colors, and they can just quickly pick out the 2 twos, which I can do if you actually change the colors, right? We'll talk about this phenomenon in the next class in attention, called a visual pop-out. Okay, so to summarize today, we talked about multisensory integration. Multisensory integration has its highest response when there's temporal and spatial congruence of the different modalities. But it does have an effect called inverse effectiveness, where basically multisensory integration is most important. The neural response is most different from unisensory stimulation when the unisensory information is weak. And in cortical areas, you have semantic congruence as well. So seeing a cat and hearing the meow plays an important role for multisensory integration. At the very end, I talked about maybe sort of different, maybe multisensory integration isn't only occurring in specialized multisensory areas, but actually unisensory areas are directly connected to each other. And finally, I gave a really short introduction to synesthesia, where you have people experiencing totally unrelated sort of perceptual experiences, or maybe even they have first order perceptual experiences from unrelated perceptual modalities. Okay, so that is all for multisensory integration. Next, I will do a lecture on attention.